Hello there, and welcome to another Bible Art Journaling Challenge. We're in Deeper Still, Lesson 4, and I'm actually covering the book of Job, and we're going to be doing some creativity right on that back page there. I've checked in a number of different journaling Bibles, and there seems to be some extra space there. You could certainly do it over your whole page somewhere else in the book of Job if you wanted, but I'm finding that space works well. So I am going to be offering you a free download if you want to use the same little artwork that I'm doing, so you can pop below the video to get a link to that free download if you want it. And some people do actually ask me how I actually create some of my own artwork, so I'm showing you. And one of the things that I like to do sometimes is just take a scan of the page that I'm hoping to do artwork on and then put it on a light box like this. I'll link to this light box in case you're interested in it. It just goes into the USB plug of my laptop, and then I can create on a really thin surface. And it's not necessary, but it is a lot of fun when you want to create something and you want to see the layer below you. This just helps me to be able to gauge how it's going to be sitting on the page and all that kind of stuff. And it's all a bit fancy, but honestly, you can just sketch on a piece of paper just as easy. And my thought as I do a heart like that is to just mark out the different little spots, and then I've got myself a little piece of artwork over time as I get it all drawn. And then you can see me here counting up the amount of characters as well as the amount of spaces that I have. And now I'm using the centimeters there. I am positioning the 12 centimeters in the middle of my page, and then I'm marking all 12, so I know exactly how many or how much space I have for each letter. And then I can just start putting my lettering in, or I could go back to the light box and trace some font from a free font or a purchased font that I'm able to use, and then I can create these sorts of things for you. Of course, I would always make sure that I'm offering you fonts that you're able to use, and then super fun to just create stuff that allows you to not have to do all of that, and then you can just trace it in your Bible by putting it behind your Bible page. It's so thin, the Bible, those paper, just you could see right through it, so that's fantastic. And then I just go in there with some pen and get it ready for you guys. So here's where I made a mistake I've never made before. You might be noticing that is white gesso, and the moment I saw an opaqueness on there, I grabbed a baby wipe and wiped it off, and no harm done. So if you notice quick enough, that is what to do if you use white gesso. I've never done that before in all of the time that I've been doing this. However, you may know if you follow along with me that I recently am recovering from a concussion, so I'm blaming the concussion. Whatever the case is, I haven't been 100% yet, but I am taking it easy and really glad to be back at work and just enjoying my time in the studio. So I have this Neocolor 2 watercolor crayon set, and it is a really big set. I have 126 colors here. I bought it as a gift for myself when it was on sale, and I actually didn't realize that in America you can only get the 86 colors. So apologies for if you are in America and seeing this and feeling like, oh my goodness, all these colors. Get as big of a set as you want, but start with something small, or use other watercolors or cheap watercolors, or use colored pencils. Use what you have, and if you want to try a new art supply, just try the small little set of something and decide what you think about it. I am actually just using a plate, and that is going to act as a palette for me. So I'm just scribbling some of the watercolor crayon right onto there, and then I'll be ready to go. So I picked a few blue shades that I might like, so I could have a darker for the shadows and a lighter for where it's not. And then I've got a couple of shades for hair, and I've got a red for doing the heart and so on. So really, really simple stuff. And then I'm just filling it in. And the only difference here is I just want you to pay attention to the types of brushes that I'm using. They're what you would call a round brush. And you only want to use a brush that's meant for watercolor, to never use acrylic with it because it won't act the same with watercolor again. So use a brush that's not been used with acrylics, and then just make sure that you are using something that's nice and round like this. It's super easy to use. And if you got something with a lot of detail, then get yourself a smaller brush. And if you got a big, huge space like this heart, then use a bigger brush. And because I've page prepped first, I don't have any bleed through. You don't have to page prep when you do watercolor, but you certainly would find it beneficial, and you'll have a much smoother page and all sorts of things like that. So while I do a bunch of coloring, I just want to talk to you about Job. The story of Job is one that really is a challenging one for a lot of people, because it really talks about suffering of someone who is relatively innocent. And there is a section in the back of Job which oftentimes gets people focused on that section, and they forget the whole rest of the book, or they look at it through that lens. So I'm going to read to you here from Job chapter 42 in verse 11. It says, "Then all his brothers and all his sisters and all who had known him before came to him, and they ate bread with him in his house, and they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversities that the Lord had brought on him." And in that moment there, people believe that that means that God brought all of this suffering. But the way in which this story unfolds is really critical, because it gives us a picture of what actually took place. So if we go to the beginning of the entire book of Job in chapter 1, starting in verse 6, we see what unfolded. It says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' Then Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From roaming about the earth and walking around it.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil.'" Can you imagine God pointing you out to Satan and saying, "Have you seen that guy? He's amazing." Can you believe that? So then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." So right here, just like when Satan tried to tempt Jesus in the wilderness years later, because this is before Jesus was born, we see an example where Satan is tempting the Lord to actually harm Job. And he says, "Put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord responds to Satan. He says, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. It's very clear here that God actually trusted Job so much to be an example of somebody who could trust God in the midst of suffering, and that God is not the one that actually brought this on Job, so to speak. When we see that in the end of the book, what we're actually seeing is that God allowed something to happen. And this is where we are able to look at love. This is why I'm drawing what I am. I think it's really important that we identify the cause of grief, because God is a God of good gifts. He doesn't give bad gifts. He gives good gifts to his children. And we cannot begin to understand all the reasons why suffering happens. I know in my own life, I've experienced more suffering in my years than I should, and you may be able to say the same in your own life. Whatever the case is, we don't have the right to look at God and say, "You gave me all these horrible things." What God sometimes does is he says, beyond our own understanding, he says, "Hey, I think you could test that person. I think you could do something to him, and he would just love me all the more." Job ended up becoming an example to us of someone who chose to cling to God even in the midst of frustration towards him or lack of understanding, and saying, please God, have mercy on me. What are you doing here? Are you sure about this? It's okay for us to be real and honest and talk to God about what's going on in our life, but it's never okay for us to turn our hearts away from him. And Job stayed soft towards him and ultimately said that he didn't understand everything as much as he would like to, and repented for some of his behavior along the way. He stayed so soft that he found ways to keep becoming soft towards the Lord in the midst of the trials which God had allowed to happen in his life. But God did not cause them. And that is the love of God, is that sometimes, can you imagine being such a good friend of God that he allows that? I just want to show you this little thing here. It's a brush pen, and you can actually make any number of widths with it because it is brush tip. And I'm just using that. You could use anything, but I just figured I would flick that from her face outward and make some little eyelashes. And it just feels a little bit more realistic than not having anything. Just don't overdo it. She's not got false lashes on, just something tiny. I just wanted something to represent understanding and remembering the true story here, which is to look at love. And God is love. He is the one who loved us enough that he cared for us. Watch how I'm holding my pen. I'm further away from the tip, and that's allowing me to make these little messy lines that I wouldn't make otherwise. So in making this, I'm just using a really loose hand, and it just ends up being a little bit playful and whimsical. So honestly, this is really simple, straightforward stuff. And I know that the book of Job is complex and there's so much that we could dive into. And I don't want to have a discussion about suffering. What I want to have a discussion about is that God is still good even when we don't understand. Even when we don't understand the things that are going on around us, we cannot allow ourselves to believe the lie that God is not good or that God causes horrible things to happen to us. What he does do is trust us with the journey. And sometimes that looks painfully difficult, but he trusts us. And I'm honored that he trusts us with those things. So this has been pretty simple. I'm just going to give it a little date stamp, and I thought about putting it on the edge of the page, but I put it inside the heart instead. And always good to make sure you're holding it the right direction before you get started. So that is it, you guys. I really want to encourage you to follow along with me and have a conversation with me over in our Facebook group. Everything's linked below the video, and just come and join us. And I will see you really soon. Love you guys so much. And thanks so much for joining me.